I'm Susan Landau. I'm chairing the first session. The talks will be 15 minutes. There'll be 3 minutes for questions at the end of each talk. The people who are on YouTube, you can send comments, and Rachel will flag me that there's a comment on YouTube for that person to do a question. Please remember to rate the talks. Now, I have to do an editorial comment here. I think, and this is not an official comment, this is a Susan comment, but I can't really say please rate the talks and not say. Rating, I think, is really important in terms of giving feedback. I'm not thrilled with the other part of it, but I'll make that comment during the town hall. But I can't say please do it without putting my editorial comment in. So the first talk is to permit or not to permit, that is the usability question, crowdsourcing mobile apps privacy permission settings by Runuda, Ishmael, Tushef Ahmed, Kelly Kane, Apu Kapadia, and Mike Ryder, and Apu will be giving the talk.
Eventually.
Eventually. Meanwhile, I will stick this on him while he... And let me ask that during the Q&A part that the next speaker come up so we can get you set up so you don't lose any time from your slot. Thanks.
Okay, all right. Can hear me? Okay. Okay, so thank you for the introduction and good morning. This is joint work with several colleagues, including Kelly Kane, who's right there. But in particular, I would like to highlight Katranada Ismail's efforts. This work would not have been possible without her, and she would have loved to be here today. And only a few things are better than a presentation at PETS, right? And one of them is having a baby. So I wish her luck, and I'm happy to be here in her place. She might actually be watching over the link, so hello. Okay, so by now we're all very familiar with mobile apps requesting access to several sensitive resources on our devices, such as our location or our contacts. In older versions of Android, users were faced with a pretty stark choice. Either accept all the permission requests, resulting in a feature-rich app, but with very little privacy, or deny all requests and get access to a whole lot of privacy, but no features. Basically, you can't install the app. Operating systems now, mobile operating systems now, however, allow users to strike a trade-off and selectively disable permissions that make them uncomfortable. Android has upgraded to this model only recently, and some of you may know that iOS has had it for a while now. But again, users are faced with the question of how their choices will actually impact usability. And indeed, to permit or not to permit these permission requests, that's the usability question that we seek to answer in this work. So it turns out that the app marketplaces already try to answer a related question about how nice an app is and whether it's worth installing. Right? In this example, the app is rated pretty highly with over 4 stars. But wouldn't it be great if the app stores could recommend suitable configurations with better privacy and reasonable usability? In this example, the marketplace is recommending disabling access to contacts and location by default for a reasonable user experience. One could think of this scenario as one of the motivating scenarios for our research in general. So one may wonder whether there are indeed configurations that sit in such a sweet spot, or the Goldilocks zone, like the one in the middle. The permissions are neither too restrictive nor too permissive and happen to result in an app with reasonable privacy. Perhaps there is not a strict privacy usability trade-off, and such configurations in the sweet spot can be found. So in the end, making such determinations in an automated fashion may be the way to go, and we'll get back to that. But we're not there yet. For example, Stowaway can perform a binary analysis and identify permissions that are requested but never used. But this approach doesn't inform permission choices for those that are actually used by an app, such as contacts and Instagram. Pyandrazzi, I hope that's how you say it, goes a step further and removes permissions from apps and evaluates the runtime effects of removing them by analyzing crash logs. But still, the impact on users is not really known or understood. Related to our work, a couple of approaches leverage the crowd to figure out which permissions are really necessary. Privacy Grade assigns grades to apps based on crowdsourced expectations and reactions about app permissions. Another work called RecDroid employs crowdsourcing to provide privacy setting recommendations to users based on the crowd's choices and tries to identify experts to improve the recommendations. In general, however, they do not capture the actual impact of permission choices on the usability of apps. In our previous work presented at CHI in 2015, we advocated crowdsourcing the usability testing of app configurations to identify suitable configurations. The crowd simply contributes ratings for the various configurations, and voila, the ratings can be aggregated to find suitable configurations that balance privacy and usability. Of course, there are way too many configurations to explore, and a more structured approach is needed. We can start by arranging these configurations in a lattice structure, where each represents a containment relationship or a configuration that removes a superset of permissions. For example, this path represents a path of successive permission removals, with each configuration more restrictive than the previous. And here you would expect usability scores to generally reduce as you go along any such path. And you can use that observation for a very simple pruning strategy. The crowd can, for example, explore the first layer only and identify any configurations that fall below a pre-specified usability threshold. Let's say 4 in this example. Any ancestors can then be pruned, as their usability scores are expected to be no better than the unusable configuration. A subset of the second layer can then be explored with more pruning and terminating when no more configurations need to be explored. Anyway, so finally, suitable configurations can be identified that are above a usability threshold. In this example, the configuration that removes access to contacts and the microphone is a suitable candidate for recommending a default. So in our previous work, we validated this strategy with a small user study with 26 users for a single app. And one of the results of that work was showing the validity of this lattice-based pruning approach, even if it was for only one app. Which brings us to this paper. So in this paper, we ask the following research questions. Number 1, is there always a trade-off between usability and privacy? Specifically, can we identify suitable configurations across a range of different app types? Second, what do lattices look like for different categories of apps? It is possible to find cases in which removing only one permission causes an app to be unstable. In other cases, removing multiple other permissions may not adversely affect the usability of the app. Studying such structures have implications not only for structured crowd management, but can also inform developers on where to concentrate their resources while building apps. And third, to what extent do different permissions affect the usability of the apps? In particular, we would like to quantify the overall impact of removing individual permissions from apps, which can be useful to isolate and estimate the importance of various permissions for an app's usability while making recommendations to users, and we'll see more of that. Okay, so to answer these research questions, very briefly, we performed an online experiment on Amazon Mechanical Turk with a sample of 555 participants with exemplar apps from each of 3 categories. So for instant messenger, we picked Facebook Messenger, as it is one of the most popular instant messaging apps out there with over 1.2 billion active users a month. For photo sharing, we chose Instagram with over 700 million monthly active users. And for microblogging, we selected Twitter with over 328 million monthly active users. So we created multiple configurations of the apps by disabling different subsets of permissions, focusing on 4 particular sensitive permissions: location, contacts, microphone, and camera. In particular, for a more direct comparison of lattice structures, we focused on these 4 permissions as they were common to the 3 apps. We should note, however, that disabling location for Twitter made the app completely unusable, and so we explored only 3 permissions for Twitter. Based on a power analysis for the types of tests we wanted to run, statistical tests, each configuration was assigned to approximately 15 participants. Each participant was asked to perform various popular tasks as determined through pilot testing. These tasks were fixed for each app category and were chosen to be a representative set of common tasks performed with these apps. All right, so following each task, participants were asked to reflect on the app's usability by answering what's called a single EASE question, or the SEQ. The SEQ is a post-task usability measure that has a single 7-point Likert scale question about task difficulty. It has been validated to be reliable and easy to respond to, as you can see. A very simple question. So to quickly boil down the take-home points for our work, I will show you the usability scores for the 3 lattices, starting with Instagram. The red dashed arrows show statistically significant changes in usability scores. And in all cases where this happens, the drops are in the decreasing direction, as we might have expected or hoped. The SEQ scale suggests 4.8 as a cutoff for what is considered below average usability. So in this case, the following configurations have reasonable usability, you could say. For example, removing contacts and microphone access results in a usability score of 5.3 compared to 5.8 for the base configuration. Very quickly, here we see the lattice structure for Facebook Messenger, which yields only one configuration low in the lattice, with the contacts permission removed. The difference in usability scores here is not statistically significant, suggesting similar usability to the base configuration. And finally, Twitter's lattice yields a decent configuration with 2 permissions disabled. The contacts and camera configuration could be considered borderline, but the one with contacts and microphone disabled results in a usability score that is practically the same as the base configuration. All right, so finally, using regression analysis, we quantify the impact of individual permissions on apps. Okay, so the model shows the baseline usability of an app in SEQ points, along with the added benefit of individual permissions. In cases where the coefficients are not obtained with statistical significance, they've been grayed out. Recalling that 4.8 was the threshold for usability in SEQ points, we can make a few observations here that line up with what we saw earlier. The baseline usability score of Facebook Messenger and Instagram is low, and several permissions need to be added to make them usable. Twitter's baseline is high, but keep in mind that in this case, only 3 permissions are modeled, and in fact, the usability is 0 when location is disabled. But perhaps more interesting is looking at the individual coefficients themselves. Removing the camera permission provides a big hit, 1.74 points to Instagram, as one might expect, but has a smaller impact on Facebook Messenger with 0.71 points. Removing the location permission impacts Facebook Messenger the least at 0.48 points. Well, we could do this for a while, but the point of all this is that we can integrate such measures into permissions interfaces to help users make more informed decisions about their choices. For example, previous work by Liu and others has shown how this interface can be modified to show how often an app has accessed each permission. So the actual impact on usability could thus measure the costs associated with the privacy choices. Before proceeding to the discussion, we should be mindful of various limitations. Firstly, we studied only 3 apps. And why? We chose to limit the apps in this study because our goal was to test the usefulness of a lattice-based approach. And it would take an incredible number of resources to test the entire library of phone apps. So to simultaneously limit our study and still impact as large a number of users as possible, we decided to study popular exemplar apps actively used, as we saw, by over 1 billion users. Although we had a specific reason to choose 4 permissions for our experiment, more work is needed to study a larger set of permissions. As always, some conditions apply to Turk studies, right? They're different. The Turkers are different from the general population, but we did pick them to be representative of crowd workers, since this is a crowdsourcing paper. One might also wonder how reliable user testing is on mTurk. However, Liu and others found mTurk to be a viable platform for usability testing. Finally, this work looks at how permissions affect the usability of apps in general and does not attempt to make recommendations based on individual usage patterns. So I'm going to skip through the last slide or 2 really quickly. So building off our limitations, we need to better understand how individual usage patterns can be leveraged for better recommendations. Developers must now make their apps usable under an exponential number of possible permission configurations. So how can we assess these developers in making more usable apps? A lattice-based approach may help. Going back to automated approaches, can we predict usability scores based on machine learning models or other proxies rather than going to users and having them really test out apps? In the end, that might be a better approach. And taking another step back, the heart of the problem is how apps get consent once for a permission and then use the permission in sometimes nefarious ways. So runtime consent platform to determine what accesses are acceptable remains an interesting challenge for researchers. So in conclusion, we validated an efficient lattice-based approach for crowdsourced exploration of these various configurations. We showed that it was possible to find configurations that improve privacy without significantly impacting usability. And we showed how the impact of different permissions can be estimated. Done, but thank you to NSF. Greatly thankful to the National Science Foundation. This work came out of their push several years ago to bring social scientists and computer scientists together to work on security problems. So thank you again. But that being said, they don't necessarily share our opinions, findings, or conclusions. Thank you.